Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRW USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invite listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to take human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Pam Bruns, founder and director emeritus of the Human Rights Watch Student Task Force of Southern California. Pam is joined in our conversation by Task Force Senior Manager Kristin Ghazarians and two Task Force student coordinators, Ren a senior at Los Altos, California High School, and Clementine a junior at Palisades Charter High School in Los Angeles, California. In this episode, Pam, Kristin, Ren, and Clementine discuss the origins of the task force and its connection to Human Rights Watch, the successes of task force programs, and the challenges they've encountered advocating human rights education in Southern California schools and communities. Well, it's a great pleasure to be conversing with not only the leader emeritus of the Student Task Force of Human Rights Watch in Southern California, but her trusted aide, Kristin Ghazarian, and two students, Ren and Clementine, all joining us for this episode of Human Rights Education Now. So your group, and I'm speaking to meaning your group, meaning all of you, since you're all participants in it, has been a leader in engaging youth in the effort to make human rights education an important part of our civic dialogue. How did that begin, though? And I'd like to start with Pam. If you could give us some details about how this all began.
It's a long time ago, but I remember it well. I was the director for Human Rights Watch here in California, and we had a very active community of activists, all adults. But I had come from a high school setting where I had been working with young people, and I knew what extraordinary activists they were. And so I introduced the idea of having a student task force who would become the youngest members of the Human Rights Watch community. And it started off with just a few chapters at a few high schools and grew from there. But 1999 was the first year we put a name on it. But I would say that the Student Task Force was active before that without a name, just that anytime we invited young people to take part in Human Rights Watch activities, they were eager to be there and eager to take part. And so they worked with us without a name, even before 1999. Especially on the campaign to eliminate the use of child soldiers around the world. They were eager to learn more about human rights, and they were the same as their older counterparts in the organization. Everybody wanted and needed to learn more about human rights. So they were in common purpose.
And Kristin, what was your impetus for getting involved?
I've been with Student Task Force now for about 11 years, so almost half of its life, which has been incredible working with Pam. Kind of grew up with an innate sense of fairness and equality. It's actually kind of a running joke in my family that everything has to be equal amongst everyone. One of my grandfathers had fought in World War II, and my other grandfather actually had family that had been killed in the Armenian genocide. And so growing up with their stories and knowing my family's history sparked my interest in genocide, which I then incorporated into research papers and projects throughout my education. And so that was my real introduction to human rights. Before joining Student Task Force, I'd been living in Cambodia teaching English, and before that working for Amnesty International. So when I found this program, I just thought it was the absolute perfect combination of engaging young people in these issues and giving them a space and a voice to learn how to be human rights advocates and do the work that I thought was so important and was so proud to be part of myself.
So you had a personal connection, you might say, Kristin, to the idea of family, and that your father had been involved in the Second World War and so forth, or a family member. I want to go back to Pam for a minute. Pam, where was your initial interest in human rights? How did that develop?
Well, I'm old enough in this group. Bill, you and I might be around the same age, but I don't know about you, but human rights was never taught or offered in any of the courses that I ever had. I grew up with civil rights, and I grew up with some of the same things Kristin's talking about, a sense of fairness and trying to be sensitive to, especially with civil rights movement. It was clear that people in this country weren't all being treated equally. So it wasn't until after college, because I never had an opportunity to study human rights in college either. It wasn't until much after college that I started to even hear the term human rights. And then it applied to so many things I'd already worked on. It gave a name and a structure and a backbone to all these things that I think so many of us feel intuitively. The young people especially have this sense of, this isn't fair, this is right, this is wrong. So human rights and human rights education, as soon as I was exposed to it, it was like, okay, there's an organizing principle here. There's a way we can look and talk about this. So Clementine, you have a big advantage over us. You're getting started.
You and I had the same experience, because there was no teaching about the Universal Declaration. You might have had one lesson on the UN, and that was about it. But you're right. And I think that's one of the real important issues in this country right now, is that there hardly is very much systematic education about human rights. But I want to turn over to Clementine. What inspired you to take an interest in human rights, Clementine?
Yeah, so at home, we didn't really talk about social issues very much. And I would say during COVID, I just became very interested in the women's rights movement and the BLM movement and the March for Our Lives and what they were doing with gun control. And after COVID, I came to Pali as a lost little sophomore, and I found STF, and I just became so interested in the work that they were doing with human rights. And I guess that's where I started to really educate myself on what human rights are, what that means, and what that looks like in this country. And so I guess that's kind of where it started, really with STF.
So if I could just follow up, you have an interest in human rights broadly defined, I'm saying. That would be a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, it started off mostly with climate activism, because I was pretty passionate about that before joining STF. And then when I joined, it was in the middle of their climate campaign. And so that kind of continued further. But yeah, I would say overall, but especially climate activism.
Okay, Ren, how about yourself?
So I was actually exposed to human rights issues a lot when I was younger. And that unfortunately wasn't because of our education system, but because I had access to the internet and I had access to social media platforms when activism and more equality focused ideology was on the rise. So I think I first had access to the internet in 2013 when I was like 8. And when I was 9 or 10, I was exposed a lot to the newer waves of feminism and racial equality movements that were going on at the time. And so as a kid, learning about all of these tragedies and inequalities around the world, it was really devastating. I was young, I was impressionable. I had no idea that these were things that were still ongoing. And so as a kid, I was really passionate about the world. I really cared about everyone around me. And, obviously I still do right now. And it's what inspired me initially to take action.
So if I can ask you, Ren, and then I'll go back to Clementine, how did you actually connect to the Student Task Force?
Over quarantine, again, with the wildfires in California, with the Black Lives Matter movement going on, me and a fellow activist who's also my peer and friend, we decided to start a human rights club together at our school. And that was kind of our first point of contact with Kristin, because we were trying to get chartered as an SDF chapter. And so I still remember that first Zoom meeting I had with Kristin, and we were just kind of talking about what got us into human rights and what we were passionate about. And Kristin was like, hey, you should definitely come join us and come swing by our meetings. And that's kind of what got us down the rabbit hole of STF.
And Clementine, how about yourself?
Yeah, so my high school has a pretty established chapter, and I found it through just wanting to join an organization that was having a pretty big impact. And I found STF through a friend actually who wanted to join, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'll sit in on a meeting and see what this is all about. And I was so amazed and captivated by the work that the upperclassmen were doing, the people that were part of the leadership team. And I was like, that's going to be me one day. I'm going to be part of that. I'm going to have a real impact like these other high schoolers. And that's kind of where it all started.
So for Pam and Kristin, and either of you could answer this, what is the way in which Human Rights Watch influences the task force? For example, does Human Rights Watch tell you there are certain priorities we're going to make in this coming year or the next few years, or basically are they hands off and allow you to proceed?
I think I'll start off on that, and then Kristin can bring us up to speed. We started off very independently. We started off here in Los Angeles, which is a long way from headquarters in New York. And so we maintained that independence, and no one has ever told us anything not to do. I mean, we've asked and solicited for suggestions from the Children's Rights Division, and we've taken a look at what everybody's doing across the organization to see what would fit best with STF and the interests of the students. But it's been independent is the best word I can use to describe it. The STF had tremendous support from the local Human Rights Watch members, and that was I won't say an insurance policy, but that gave STF a real firm foundation to establish itself on, because it had the full support of all of the adult members of the Human Rights Watch organization here in Los Angeles. So it's not like Amnesty and Bill, I know you were an Amnesty advisor for many, many years, and I know you were an outstanding one. We would have liked to have had you on STF. We had the benefits of independence and determining our own direction, but we also didn't have anybody handing us materials or giving us the talking points or the campaign objectives. Sometimes we would get those from New York, but for the most part, STF has really tried to match the interests of the students with what we knew was going on in Human Rights Watch, the kinds of materials we knew we could get our hands on. And it's a good point to hand off to Kristin.
We actually are still doing that today, but we are doing more to integrate and incorporate the strategic goals and vision of Human Rights Watch in the advocacy. So for example, this semester, the students have been working to protect the human rights of asylum seekers coming to the US-Mexico border by advocating with congressional representatives to stop the use of deadly deterrence policies. That advocacy piece came from partnering with two of the Human Rights Watch US program staff members that are working on these issues, both in Mexico City and in Washington, D.C. And so while they are not telling us what we can and cannot work on, we are collaborating often with the organization.
So in that sense, let me just follow up on that, and then I'll come back to you, Pam. In that sense, you are working to advance a sort of broader goal, and at times you've received, for lack of a better term, technical assistance on how to advance it. Is that fair?
Is that for Chris?
Sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Pam.
Well, no, I was just going to say I wanted to really correct what I'd said about the independence. We had independence of choice. We stayed within the organization's research and advocacy objectives because we don't have the resources to go out and do that research that would be dependable, or the experience and expertise that the Human Rights Watch researchers bring to every issue that they tackle. So our independence came in our ability to look at the vast array of research efforts that were being made by the organization and the many different campaigns and advocacy objectives that they established. And that's where we could really, pick and choose and say, okay, this meets our needs. There might be an excellent campaign, for instance, going on in Ecuador with the use of child labor there. But we might look at that and say, oh, I don't know if the kids will be able to identify with these child laborers in Ecuador in such a narrow. We need to find something that's broader, like the Child Soldier Campaign that's international. So I want to clarify that because I think I got a little bit heavy on the independence there. Because the Human Rights Watch organization, anybody who's ever looked at their webpage, the depth and breadth of Human Rights Watch research is extraordinary. And that's what we always have to draw on. And the students, I hope, become familiar with that website and take it on into college because probably one of the most reliable resources one can use about the status of human rights around the world, including in the United States.
And I think that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Save the Children, all these are NGOs that have advanced human rights in ways that nobody could have really conceived at the end of the Second World War. I mean, I would argue, and I'd like to get all of your opinions on this, that without these NGOs, the human rights movement in the world today would be far weaker. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
So I want to go back to Ren and then Clementine. You mentioned that you got engaged with human rights either at home first and then possibly through the organization. You joined the Student Task Force in your own schools. Well, what roles and activities do you actually participate in? I mean, Clementine mentioned leadership and so forth. And I'm looking on your website, I notice you have not only faculty advisors, but you have student leaders and you have a vast alumni network. So let's start with Ren. What are some of the things you actually do that lead you to become sort of a person who's advancing human rights in your school?
So a lot of what we do in STF, we facilitate through our weekly calls. We meet, I believe, every Sunday in the evening, and we talk about the progress that we have made at our schools, on our campuses, and we also talk about, future goals, setting out some next steps so that we continue advancing human rights on our local level. And in addition to that, we also do seasonal workshops. So there's one every semester. And in these workshops, we learn a lot of leadership skills and how we can bring these things back to our community. So it's about having that centralized group talk about all of these things like advancing leadership and how we can bring human rights advocacy and awareness to our campuses, and then following through with that to bring it to our local communities.
Clementine, you go ahead and tell us how you see it, and then I'm going to come back to both of you with a follow-up.
Yeah, so adding on to what Ren was saying, we also do quite a bit of collaboration with other schools. So STF leaders get to meet with other leaders from other campuses, and we get to talk and discuss and collaborate on what events worked and what events didn't work, and what, how we can improve in the future. What I also really like about STF is that we have on-campus events, like tent events, where we get to bring classes through and educate them about our current campaign. We do like film screenings and letter writing campaigns. We work with administration on projects that we're trying to make happen at our school. So it's a wide variety of projects, I guess.
So now I'm going to start with Ren and again come back to you, Clementine. Give us an example of a project, taking it from beginning to end, that you've participated in your school.
Oh, wow. So me and Elisa, who is the other leader that's part of STF from my school, we started out when STF was still in our climate crisis campaign, where we were trying to turn our schools to 100% green energy. So we started out by having very limited data on what was going on at our schools, right? We knew a lot of things like surface level, like, oh, we have solar panels in the parking lots. So we started with deep diving into that research to see what our campus was like. Then we followed up and made some plans on where we as students could see improvements. And these were all things we talked about in STF during our weekly calls. Like, we would give each other the rundowns of our campuses and then brainstorm on how to, like, where we could improve or how to talk to our district administration. Then we actually did have multiple talks with our district administration. We were able to push for more transparency and energy usage, and we were able to actually expand the solar paneling at some of our campuses because we would role play scenarios and be able to act out these talks and to see what techniques worked best during our workshops and during our weekly calls.
So who's the audience for your work when you do those scenarios and those role plays? Is it the whole student body? Is it a certain group of students? Is it adults? How does that operate?
In the ones that we did during the climate crisis campaign, we were mainly role-playing talking with teachers on integrating climate education and also administration on perhaps seeing how we can improve our facilities and how to improve renewability.
So did you run into any skeptics and or critics who said that you're not convincing me, or did you convince some people by turning them around?
We actually did with our principal. His initial reaction, because that was also his first year at our school, was that I don't want to take a political stance on this. It seems too political, which climate change is generally a more neutral topic too in terms of human rights. So we were able to kind of push that idea that, well, we're not asking you to take any political stance. We're simply asking you to look at our facilities and go, how can we be better for our environment and our students? And that's how we were able to kind of get him on board, even though he was very reluctant at first.
So to sum it up, you engaged in rational persuasion. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay, Clementine, how about you? Talk to us about a project from beginning to end.
Yeah, so similarly, I joined STF during the climate campaign, and our chapter was working to also make Poly 100%, run on 100% renewable energy. And I joined at the time when we were trying to convince our board of trustees of approving of our solar proposal, which was quite a task. And so we had a couple of students get together to make public comments and just really voice their opinions and passion and, why it was so important to get the solar panels at Poly and to make sure that the board approved the proposal. And finally it got approved. And so we've been working for almost 2 years now with LUSD to try and get solar panels on the roofs. But then part of that proposal was also integrating climate education in the classroom. And so we did, we have this thing called Poly period at my school. And so it's a period of time where students get to kind of catch up on work or make up tasks. But then we also have like school-wide initiatives. And so for Earth Day, we had this one initiative where every teacher found a way of integrating climate into their subject. So like science teacher was, talking about how biology connects to the climate crisis, and history was also doing that. Same thing with English. And the results were incredible. Students, the response was overwhelmingly positive and students loved it. And then another example of that is we did a letter writing campaign recently where students had the opportunity to write letters basically expressing their concern about the climate crisis. And we sent over like 500 letters to each person. So we sent letters to Karen Bass, to Nick Malvoin, and to Jeff Bezos. And it was like a really impactful thing that we did. And yeah.
Okay, so turning back to Pam and Kristin now, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the faculty engagement in the Student Task Force. I think Clementine and Ren have done a great job talking about how students are engaged, but how do you engage teachers?
Well, some of this is probably going to sound very familiar to you, and I may turn the tables on you, Bill, and ask you how you did it when you were active with Amnesty. But it's really on a case-by-case basis in terms of finding and identifying teachers that are willing to be advisors for the Student Task Force chapters. In some cases, a teacher heard about it and came to us, but in most cases, students would come to us and ask to start a chapter at their school. And we always say that there needs to be a faculty advisor who's part of the group. And the faculty advisor is essential, as you understand, in order to get permission to do things on campus, to be able to speak to other students, but also to the faculty, to have events. It's just essential that someone's there to help the students be able to deal with the administration and just the school rules. So the teacher advisor is very important, and it's been a different situation with every advisor that we've had. Some have come with a background in human rights or in civil rights and activism. But in some cases, teachers have come who have no experience in activism, and it's a learning experience for them as they learn along with the students in terms of understanding what the campaign is about and understanding what the human rights are that are involved in the campaign. So I would say for every teacher, it's a different situation.
Kristin, you want to add?
I think Pam explained it perfectly, as well as the ability of the teacher to engage and support with the students, to offer guidance. And sometimes they are able to be the biggest cheerleaders for our students and are standing at those board meetings celebrating right alongside. And other times they're able to support on campus and provide that liaison between administrators and students as needed. But we truly value our teachers and are appreciative of all of them for their time and dedication to our program.
Now, how do you engage the teachers in expanding understanding of human rights beyond the advisor? Because I found that was a challenge in order to have people who were, for lack of a better term, either uninformed or skeptical about human rights, trying to help them become more knowledgeable. Do you engage in workshops or other types of professional development?
It depends on the school. In some of the schools, we've been able to hold school-wide faculty training sessions or workshops, but it really depends on the school. And again, that relies a lot on who the teacher advisor is and whether they're willing to take on the extra work that it will take to get the rest of the community, of their own faculty community, involved. So we can certainly point to some schools that have spent a lot of time and energy trying to engage more of the faculty in human rights education. And then in other schools where it's a little bit more work. Some of our schools are in very conservative areas where we have principals like the one Ren refers to, who just are afraid of human rights as too political and something that'll just get him in a lot of trouble. And so you may just end up working with a teacher.
There was a lot of community backlash against what we did. So specifically during our climate crisis campaign, when we had students from our clubs speak at board meetings, the board meetings were typically very heavily overdominated by individuals who were less enthusiastic for progress. And so we didn't get great reception from the public in terms of the board meeting, but also it was difficult to talk to higher ups and talk to even teachers about integrating climate education into the curriculum because of the fear that it was perceived as too political, or for the fear that parents were going to call and email and send nasty comments to the teachers for teaching something that was too biased or too political leaning, in that sense, that it was just so controversial all of the time. But it was also just difficult trying to educate our peers on things that they don't really think about on a day-to-day basis. Like, we all know that climate change exists, but it's very difficult for people to acknowledge, especially like during a lunch period, that climate change is real and it's something that it will be concerning during our lifetime. It was hard to get people to care because it was just so, for them, it felt like a far off fantasy and that they would rather not acknowledge it than take the time to educate themselves.
Clementine?
Yes, absolutely. I would say when it comes to, trying to advance human rights at Pali, there's been, I've been very fortunate to have a very supportive administration and teachers and staff, but because it is such a big school, there are quite a bit of students that are, I would say, apathetic because they can't really relate to the issue. Like they don't really see themselves in the human rights issue that we're talking about. Like Ren was talking about with climate change, they don't think that it affects them personally. So they're like, I don't really need to learn about this or talk about this. It's not a big deal. And so I would say that has definitely been one of the biggest challenges, is just getting that through to students that that it does impact you and that it is important.
Do you feel, Clementine, and I'll come back to you, Ren, that the people who are resistant to it, meaning young people of your peers, have been either not educated about it, or they've been educated about it or informed about it in a way that only gives them a narrow viewpoint? Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, I definitely think so, because when you have a class, when a teacher brings a class to a tent event, for example, and you have other students talking to them about the issue, and they're taking notes, that you can tell that they are actually really interested in it, and there's like a little light bulb that turns on. And it's a really amazing thing to see. I think it's just like, sometimes they goof around with their friends and they're like, this isn't that serious. But then I think when there actually is that like thorough education implemented, then I think that kind of gets rid of the not caring.
Ren?
I absolutely agree with everything Clementine said. I remember specifically one incident during our global climate strike times when we had students come up to our table during lunch, and we were able to talk to them and explain to them why specifically climate change was such a big issue and that it was affecting other people way more than it affects us. But because we're in Southern California, clearly we're also being affected. It shows them a new perspective that they haven't really seen before, because a lot of people in Southern California know about the wildfires, but sometimes they might not make the connection between wildfires and climate change. And so when we're able to kind of broaden that perspective and create some of those links and explain why it happens, a lot of students are a lot more invested in climate change and the climate crisis that we have.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode concludes our conversation with Pam Bruns, Kristin Ghazarians, Ren and Clementine Koss and their work in the Human Rights Watch Student Task Force of Southern California. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRWUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terugan, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.